Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to Green Infrastructure in the Delta, the sixth and final session of this year's Smart Growth Summit, presented by the Center for Planning Excellence in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My name is Justin Kozak. I'm a project manager here at CPEX. If you've been with us for the previous 5 sessions, you know that this year's summit has 3 big themes driving the discussion on planning: COVID-19, equity, and climate change. The summit began by exploring the past, present, and future of adapting in uncertain times, and how cities have adapted and can adapt their businesses and transportation systems to COVID restrictions. Then we continued with a frank and timely discussion on the role Black-owned businesses play in healthy, thriving communities. And during the summit's Climate Week, we heard what climate change has in store for us and for Louisiana in particular, and what we need to do to mitigate and adapt equitably. Spoiler alert on that one if you haven't seen it yet, the status quo is not our friend. 2 weeks ago, we continued that conversation with a look at healthy community design. COVID-19 has exposed gaps in our infrastructure and our policy environment that are causing us to rethink how our neighborhood environments, public spaces, and systems at all scales affect our health. Which brings us to today's session. I had the privilege of helping organize this year's Green Infrastructure session. Green infrastructure is always one of the Smart Growth Summit's most popular topics, and every year we try to bring a different perspective, bring a new lens to the topic. This year is no different. One consistent feature of 2020 is that it's never stopped forcing us to ask questions. Whether it was new questions emerging from a global pandemic, the increasing urgency around familiar questions of race and equity, or persistent questions about climate change and what our future will look like. We are constantly grappling with preconceived notions and assumptions about the world around us. Perhaps that's why when organizing this session, our panelists asked questions as much as they offered answers. Or perhaps this session is a prescient homage to Alex Trebek, who always maintained that facts and words matter while requiring us to continuously ask questions. Wherever the inspiration for this session came from, we think you'll enjoy it. Now, before we begin, CPEX would like to thank today's session sponsor, the Louisiana Office of Community Development. We'd also like to acknowledge all of our sponsors, including our platinum sponsors, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Louisiana, Greater New Orleans Foundation, Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, and 89.3 WRKF. And to our gold sponsors, the American Planning Association, Louisiana Chapter, LSU Ag Center, and the Nature Conservancy. Closed captioning is being provided by AARP Louisiana. Just a few housekeeping items to address before we get started. Today's session has been pre-approved for continuing education credits for certified planners and certified floodplain managers. To receive CFM credit, participants must respond to each of the polling questions that will be asked at the beginning of the session and submit information in the exit survey at the end of the session. Realtors, architects, and landscape architects may self-report credit. Please visit the Continuing Education tab at our website, summit.cpex.org, for more information. You may turn on closed captioning using the button at the bottom of your screen. We're reserving the final portion of this session for a panel discussion, including questions from you, our viewers. Please enter your questions into the Q&A using the button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we are recording this session, and all registrants will receive an email with the video link after the session. With that out of the way, I am now pleased to introduce today's moderator, James Logan. James currently serves as a program officer at the Greater New Orleans Foundation with a primary focus on environment, workforce, and equity. He's a mission-driven advocate with over 15 years of experience in planning, creating, and maintaining social justice entities. James, I'll let you take it from here.
Good afternoon. The title of the session is Green Infrastructure in the Delta. Green infrastructure and Delta are 2 concepts that have a wide range of definitions. Typically, when people think of green infrastructure, they think of rain gardens, bioswales, green roofs, rain barrels, and permeable pavers. But recent shifts in federal policies and programs driven by a shifting collective understanding of working with nature has blurred the lines between historic ideas of green infrastructure and larger projects. FEMA now promotes nature-based solutions and has amended its benefit cost analysis policy to accommodate them. The Army Corps of Engineers offers best practices of engineering with nature and even has a podcast dedicated to it. This has taken the concept of green infrastructure as a means of addressing water quality and local stormwater management needs and expanded it into the fields of disaster resilience and flood risk mitigation. Ultimately, whether you call it green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, or engineering with nature, the underlying principles are the same. achieving social, economic, public health, and environmental goals by harnessing or preserving natural processes. As for the Delta, this too is thought of in many ways. It's a landform, a geography, a multifaceted culture, and a place with its own unique challenges. It's a place of high water tables and low relief, a place of economic opportunity and significant flood risk, a place where life flows the rhythms of the seasons and the hydrologic cycle. Implementing green infrastructure in that context comes with its own challenges. At one scale, it can be intimately personal. It's in your yard, on your street, and dotted throughout your neighborhood. But on a larger scale, it becomes part of the landscape and is demonstratively different from small-scale interventions. Those different contexts, those different scales create a lot of differences in how we think about green infrastructure. How do we communicate with stakeholders? How do we engage and educate? How do we value the project and rationalize that value? Who has agency in decision-making? How do assumptions vary across scales? As you can see, the scale issue raises a lot of questions for green infrastructure. These questions guided the development of this session, where our panelists will consider green infrastructure at these three different scales in the Delta. Today's speakers are Aaron Chang, Jessica Dandridge, and Blake Crow. Aaron Chang is an urban designer, researcher, and educator based in New Orleans. He's the co-founder and co-lead of the Water Leaders Institute. He's currently working on a water map of New Orleans, as well as the New Orleans Gentilly Resilience District. He's also a founder of Civic Studio, formerly the Blue House, a cooperative focused on civic dialogue, multidisciplinary storytelling, and equitable planning and design practices. As the executive director of the Water Collaborative of Greater New Orleans, Jessica Dandridge has dedicated her life to community advocacy and campaign development for organizations seeking to be socially, economically, and culturally inclusive. She's a trained facilitator from YPQI, has a certificate in leadership, activism, and civil rights from Brown University, and a certificate in Kingian nonviolent strategies from the Selma Center of Nonviolence. Blake Crow is an urban planner and senior associate at Dana Brown and Associates. He's a certified green infrastructure professional with design and build experience. Blake believes that the greatest progress is achievable through multi-level communication and adaptivity. Blake has applied this approach as the Dana Brown Team Program Manager for the Community Adaptation Program, which provides grant-funded stormwater management solutions to low and to middle-income homeowners in New Orleans Gentilly neighborhood. Before I hand off to our first speaker, we will have 5 poll questions for you about today's topic. I will read the questions aloud, and for each question, there will be an image presented. For those unfamiliar with Zoom polling, the poll will pop up in the middle of your screen. You may move the poll pop-up window to one side to better view the slides. Let's begin with our first question. This is an example of permeable parking. It allows water to infiltrate instead of going into a storm drain. What best characterizes this image? Green or natural, gray or engineered, hybrid, or none of the above? Now let's see the results. Now let's go on to poll question number 2. This is a rain barrel. It captures water running off the roof and redirects it instead of allowing it to flow directly to a storm drain. What best characterizes this image? All right, now let's see the results. As you can see, it's pretty close with hybrid coming in at 37%, green and natural coming in at 33%, and gray and engineered coming in at 28%. Let's go to our next poll. This is a diagram of the future mid-Barataria sediment diversion. It's designed to mitigate land loss by reducing sediment and fresh water into coastal marshes. What best characterizes this image? Now let's see the results. As you can see, 53% said gray and engineered, 35% said hybrid, and 10% said green and natural. So let's go to poll number 4. This is a bioswale. It is designed to convey stormwater runoff, remove debris and pollution, and recharge groundwater. What best characterizes this image? All right, now let's see the results. As you can see, 69% of people said that it's characterized by green and natural, 24% said hybrid, and 7% said gray and engineered. So let's begin poll number 5. This is a retention pond. It consists of a permanent pond area with additional storage capacity to retain surface runoff during rain events. What best characterizes this image? All right, now let's look at the results. So as you can see, 38% of participants said green and natural, 37% said hybrid, and 24% said gray and engineered. So as you can see, even though each of these images shows an intervention that captures, recreates, or reestablishes a natural process, there is some diversity of thought on how it's characterized. This is important because how we characterize something influences how we value it, how we approach its design and implementation, and how we communicate its purpose. With that in mind, Blake Crow will start us off at the Watershed Scale.
Thank you, James. So like James said, we're starting out at the big picture, which is in this case, the Watershed Scale. On the next page, we have a map of Tangipahoa Parish, where my company, Dana Brown and Associates, did a stormwater study. And what is being shown here is how the rain that lands on the ground can end up all in the same place. So when you're thinking about the watershed, you're really thinking about how everything is interconnected, and in this particular instance would empty into Lake Pontchartrain. So something to consider, as you can also see the political boundaries of the parishes and the state, is that the water is not concerned with those at all. So something to be cognizant of is working with entities upstream and making sure that you are not only considering local water quality, but also that of what is coming in to your boundaries. And you're also trying to capture it as close to where it lands. So with that, there's many benefits. You're allowing it not to run off, but you're also less likely to be contaminating other areas downstream. So one thing to consider when we're thinking back to those poll questions is the purpose of the gray infrastructure. So we've done it for a long time. It's the way that we naturally have been taught to think about moving stormwater. But it's really just relocating the water. And when you have catch basins and pipes, they're carrying it away, but it's just carrying it out of sight. It doesn't mean that it's not an issue anymore. So when you're thinking about the utilities and the infrastructure that are going to be helping you manage your water, you also need to be taking into, as a planner, taking into the idea of how you're going to work together. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. That the design is not going to be universal. So if it works upstream and they have a really great stormwater plan and you say, hey, we should adopt that and bring it down here, you definitely need to consider everything from the soils to the native species to microclimates, everything that's going on in your environment. And one final thing I'll touch on is that this goes beyond the Delta. This can be applied anywhere. So you have places on an even larger scale at the state level, say, where in Colorado, half of the reservoirs are empty because there's been a drought for 20 years. And then just over in California, one of the tallest dams in the country, in the world, almost broke in 2017 from the amount of water that it received. So there's many factors to consider. I'm going to let Aaron go into levees and dams and more of that. If you want to take it away, Aaron.
Sure, thanks, Blake. I think when I'm thinking about this question of green gray infrastructure, for me, what I'm going to keep coming back to today is how do we use that word green? How do we think about green in relation to natural, in relation to ecological, and how these words are part of our everyday practices as planners, as designers, as engineers, and everything that they stand for. So I think if I had my druthers, we would run that poll for another hour and show you images of the Mississippi, show you images of the Coastal Master Plan, show you images of coastal restoration efforts, and super interesting to see people's responses to the images that we've seen and whether or not we perceive them as green or natural or gray versus or engineered. I'm starting off here with an image of the Coastal Master Plan. I think, as we all know, there are aspects of this plan which are about recreating some of the habitats and restoring some of the ecosystems that we associate with the Delta. So we see in the key marsh creation, ridge restoration, shoreline protection, barrier island restoration. So I think there's an understanding of a natural environment that we have done damage to, and then the ways in which we might invest billions of dollars of funding, a lot of energy and resources into restoring that environment to the best of our ability. Next slide, please. I think, as we also know, a big part of why the Delta is subsiding and falling apart, in addition to oil and gas and some other factors, one of the key reasons is the ways in which we've constrained the river's flow. So So as James mentioned, I'm working on a water map of New Orleans project. And in doing so, we're looking at a lot of different old maps. And in this sequence, we start with the famous Fisk maps of the river and how it's changed course over time. The next one shows the plantations along River Road, and the next one, Army Corps. And in the last two, it's an image of the plantations along River Road in Cancer Alley. And the one thing I want to point out here is that when we think about restoration and protection at the watershed scale, at the scale of the Mississippi River, it's not as simple as restoring ecological functions. There are a lot of different systems we put in place, the systems of social control, the enslaved people who were made to build up the levees to protect the plantations that they were also then forced to work on, the navigation systems that have become dependent, the global economies, the global flows of products and capital that are contingent on a Mississippi River staying in its place, and the ways in which those forms of social, economic, political control are all equally powerful in shaping our understanding of what the natural flow of the river is. So yeah, next slide, please. So when we think about these are diagrams that are in progress, but on the left is a section perspective of a kind of a cut through the river and the surrounding landscape in a pre-colonial era, a landscape where bayous and the river were able to flow and shift across the landscape, where tidal flows in Lake Pontchartrain came in and out of the coastal marshes. And on the right, the images that the red shows not just the systems of physical control, but that there are, again, social, political, and economic systems that are equally important in shaping our understanding of what natural flow looks like. I'm going to pass it over to Jessica.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Aaron and Blake. That was great, and it actually sets up this my section really well. You're looking at a series of 4 images, and I'll get to what they are in a minute, but I want to set up the larger concept or the theme here. How many of us use the concept water as a human right in our daily lives? You may have seen it on protests, you may actually say it, you may have a bumper sticker of it. It sounds noble and implies a sense of equity. Like many of the moral concepts that we use today, liberty, justice, inalienable rights, we often use these terms for policy matters. Healthcare, food, shelter, all things that man cultivates and builds in order to survive. Water was not built for us to survive. Water predates us. Water has its own voice, its own process, its own goals. Water does not serve our needs as humans. It serves all living creatures. And most importantly, it doesn't think of itself as an inalienable right for us. It's not an inalienable right for us to control or consume. This perspective is common amongst Indigenous communities who I've been working with throughout the summer. Across the country, and probably not popular in any way, you don't hear people say, well, water isn't a human right. Many Americans have instead taken the very neoliberal approach that Aaron was just speaking about to water, conquering and control. If you're from that school of thought, all watersheds, waterways, urban landscapes, and great infrastructure require us to control it. The relationship we have with the Mississippi River speaks specifically to that understanding and purpose. So how many of us also speak of that in the sense of managing, conquering, or controlling? And why do we do that? Thinking of the history of the Mississippi River, Indigenous communities along the Mississippi River Valley were removed from their lands for the sale of these lands to private owners for cotton, sugar cane, indigo, and so on. White Anglo's conventional view of Indigenous people were viewed as savage and uncivilized. So even if they had technological advances on managing water, we didn't actually use them. They were deemed unnecessary and, again, not sophisticated. Indigenous sites were then desecrated, and then they made way for economic development. Farmers started cultivating the lands that were already prone to flooding, but a larger system became at play. The enslavement of African Americans into chattel slavery. The shipment of people using the river. The shipment leads people the shipment of goods and other things all led to people being used for these kind of things. Ownership of waterways was always for financial gain, for capitalism. The French, the Spanish, and the Americans always had one goal in mind, when particularly in the sense of New Orleans, controlling the river and the goods that flowed into it and out of it. Multitude of flood control acts were meant to control the river. We had the Flood Act of 1917, which was the first one that Aaron kind of spoke to, where plantation owners rallied the federal government to protect their plantations from flooding, although they built a plantation on a river, which will probably flood, but we're not going to get into the logistics of that. Then they had the Flood Control Act of 1927, which, the Great Flood of 1927 and the Flood Control Act of 1928. All of that led to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers building what we know as great infrastructure, our levees, our canals, our systems that manage our water. Given the fact, who has the right to wall off natural waterways and watersheds? The above photos is a story of our Mississippi River. The first two are natural pathways. This was before access to the river was blocked by plantations and businesses and petrochemical companies today. The third and through the fifth are the progressions of the city of New Orleans, but around the construction of the river and the industries that have increased on the river. But how intimidating is it to know that the failure of one levee wall is the destruction of homes and businesses in a split second? This is our way of life. We live in the idea that we're controlling the water, we're controlling the river, but she's always there to remind us that that's not the case. I'm going to end on a quote by Mark Twain and say from his life on the Mississippi River, one who knows the Mississippi will promptly aver, not aloud to himself, that 10,000 river commissions with the minds of the world on their backs cannot tame the lawless stream, cannot curb it or confine it, cannot say it, go here or go there or make it obey, cannot save a shore which it has sentenced, cannot bar its path with an obstruction which it will not tear down, dance over and laugh at. So as we look at all these ideas, are we really controlling the river on a watershed scale? So we're going to move to the city scale. Thank you so much. And if you look at my slide here, you may think, well, who are these white guys? You've probably seen a lot of photos like this already. And it connects directly to what I was talking about earlier. This photo is old. I don't need to tell you who it is, but I will. It's the Sewage and Water Board Commission. This year doesn't really matter because there's a lot of other photos from other years that look exactly like this one. I couldn't have gotten any additional photos, but it would have been redundant. White men in a boardroom making decisions and deciding the philosophical and physical relationship we have with water. Pumps, levees, canals, and ditches, and so on are continued philosophies that we carry with us today. Even green infrastructure, we ask the same question. Can land be too free? Can water be too free? I often get questions about bioswales as, well, what if the water stays? Like it's a fear. This philosophical mindset that the men in these boardrooms have continued and perpetuated through policy. Our culture of managing waters are relics of the 19th century. They determine our policies and what is acceptable. Flooding and greenery became demonized as catalysts for economic loss and health concerns after the flood of 1927, among many others. As well as the yellow fever epidemic, a lot of people considered water as dangerous, and it is dangerous. There's no question about it. But there was only one pathway to figuring out how to manage the danger, how to manage the situations that we live in. But that goes further than just the concept of the philosophical, but it's actually how we view it in our city scales. Water and greenery became luxurious, right? People think oak trees and lined streets here in New Orleans, St. Charles, and so on. But parks and recreation were only accessible to wealthy communities with the means to travel. Disenfranchised communities all over the country, particularly here in New Orleans, since we're looking at our city, are paved. And rural communities are unkept and disorganized. If you go outside, people aren't cutting the grass and mowing it and designing it. Water infrastructure improvements are based on taxes. Government stopped investment in local infrastructure in the early 20th century, making it totally unaffordable what we see today. There are no tax incentives to run a utility company and provide street improvements. Unlike energy companies, which are incentivized through the market, water is not incentivized to the market. So after all of the work we've done to engineer it and tell it how to act and what to do, we now don't even invest in it. So now it impacts our overall water quality, our overall water systems, our way of life. And it led to situations like Hurricane Katrina, where many of our levees failed because we disinvested in it. So we continually create policy to control it, but then we don't look at the citywide scale and say, should we continue to invest in it? I was going to leave on a point about what I said earlier with water and greenery being luxurious, right? Because if you have access to it, it means you know how to control it properly, which means then that you have an understanding of what it does. I used to work at Audubon with a lot of young kids, but I worked with students and children who lived uptown, who had access to Audubon Park and the big oak trees. And it would always fascinate me where you had Black children from the inner cities of New Orleans come in and they didn't know what a tree was. Like they'd never seen an oak tree that big. And they would always come up to me and say, wow, like I've never seen flowers like this. And so we want to also think about on the citywide scale, are we looking at greenery in a sense of privilege? Who has access to green infrastructure? Who has access to water infrastructure? But more so, who has access to water and greenery in its most natural state? So I just set up the concept. I'm going to hand it over to my good friend Blake, who's going to talk more about the city scale.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, so on that note that you were just going over about the differences just within the same city, we need to try to not only find a balance for every community to have those amenities and basic rights, but we also have to find the balance between the green and gray. So when we're going over green versus gray versus hybrid, just for the sake of my discussion, I don't want to speak for anyone else. My distinction for green infrastructure is that it's a sort of low impact engineering. So it's something that exists in urbanized areas, and it's something that we have defined. And sometimes it's low impact development rather than green infrastructure or stormwater management. But the natural is what you see in more rural areas. So that's when everything that we mimic in the city is at full force. So in the slide, you can see there's a picture on the right that contains two different diagrams and maps. And so when we're thinking about all these pipes and canals and gray infrastructure, we're overlaying it on top of what's already there. So the natural topography, the soils that are already there, the drainage flow. And so one of the things that we need to do to be able to implement this hybrid or collective move towards being able to navigate and handle the water across an entire town or parish, et cetera, is making development be aware that there are benefits and that people do want them, and more people are going to want them the more visible that they are. So for example, we're talking about, as you can see, the stormwater volume credit trading program. That's just the cover. There's a lot of great detail in there, but we're talking about providing developers with either incentives or credits or whatever it may take, but without allowing or let's say using it as an excuse so that they can build higher intensity or more intense uses. So if we can have those conversations and get people to come together, I think that's the way that we're actually going to make the change. We'll get into more of the personal level and neighborhood level later. But for now, I will hand it off to Aaron.
Thanks, Blake. Next slide, please. So this is an image from just last weekend, actually, that a colleague of mine took at the University of New Orleans campus on the lakefront. And if you look at the sign, these trees once stood erect. Their current state is a vivid reminder of the incredible force of nature that changed New Orleans forever. It's the Hurricane Katrina Memorial that the student government at UNO actually erected in 2010, 5 years after Katrina. And you can see how those trees are bending as a result of the storm. If we go on to the next image, I want to start with that because that picture was taken on a piece of land that didn't exist before the 20th century. That was land, it was soil that was dredged out of the bottom of the lake and formed into the levee in the lakefront that we know today, and that the university itself was built upon. And so it's interesting for me in that spot to see the ways in which the word nature is used, the Katrina as a force of nature on a piece of land that is 100% artificial. And when we look at these maps, again, of the city, on the left, Sauvet's Crevasse from 1849, and then as the city was planning to put in place its modern drainage system, this map from 1895, showing the drainage canals out to the lake, where in the representation we've stripped away this swamp. We are preparing this seemingly empty ground for human habitation. And I bring these up as we go to the next slide, and I just want to share a little bit from the work I did as a urban designer and planner at Wagner and Ball a few years ago. We were developing, this was in 2011 to 2013, developing the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan. And so this multi-million-dollar planning effort is the basis for a lot of the green infrastructure and resilience work that we see in the city today. So on the left is a kind of diagram showing all the different proposed interceptor streets, bioswales, rain gardens, canals, blue-green corridors. And a number of these are being implemented right now through the Gentilly Resilience District. Before we move on the right are two diagrams showing this basic shift in approach. So if we had to boil down the urban water plan, which is which the proposed work would cost $6 billion to implement over 3 parishes, it's a shift from the highly paved landscapes and the reliance on pumping systems to slowing down the flow of water, using vegetation, using rain gardens and bioswales and trees, storing them in detention and retention bases and wetlands, and in doing so, reducing our reliance on that obviously great infrastructure of pumping, right? I think that if you go to the next slide, this is from a collaborative effort, but these are paintings by Ann Nelson for a project called Mixed Media Water Systems. And in it, she is exploring through an artistic lens, the transition from a city that is one swamp, if we go from left to right, that is paved over and built upon. And then if you zoom in that third painting, that third collage, you zoom into the scale of permeable paving and rain gardens, the idea that water can once again flow through the hard surfaces of our urban environment and into the ground. And on the right is, if you zoom back out, Anne's imagining of a city that has found some kind of balance again, that is able to reintegrate water into that urban grid, that urban environment. And I'll use this to transition to the neighborhood scale. And so when we think about green infrastructure and we look at this image of a bump out, and we think about what it takes to transition from, I think for the urban water plan, we called it an integrated living water system. And we could spend an hour talking about each of those words. What is living? What is integrated? We go to the next slide. So this is a project I'm working on right now. It's part of the city's Gentilly Resilience District, where New Orleans was awarded $141 million to implement aspects of the urban water plan throughout Gentilly. And so this is the St. Anthony Green Streets project. And on the right is an existing rain garden in that neighborhood. And these are younger neighborhood residents kind of exploring and learning what a rain garden is. On the left is an image of one of the proposed retrofits where bioswales would be integrated into a neighborhood playground called Gatto Playground. And And so I think there's a lot to be said for the value of reintroducing trees, of creating spaces where water can pool and soak into the ground. And it's hard to argue against the value, the efficacy of that. Next slide, please. This is at an even finer grain. This is Deb Abibu, another neighborhood resident. We're doing a walking tour of the neighborhood, and she's pointing out a rain garden that she created in her own front yard, and talking about the plants and what's doing well and what's not. And on the right is a young kid at one of our workshops, kind of starting to create her own ideas about what rain gardens might look like in relation to playgrounds. Next. One of the things that we also have been doing as part of that St. Anthony Green Streets effort, though, is to not just focus on that almost minute scale of plants and rain gardens. Again, not to say that that's unimportant, but we've also taken residents on walking tours. So this is a visit to the pump station number 4 in Gentilly, which drains that entire neighborhood, so that kids and adults are able to see the inside of a pump and start to see the scale of our gray drainage infrastructure, and also the ways in which, if you see all that trash on the right, that was really noteworthy for all the participants. Everyone walked away thinking about the relationships between our material usage and how that relates to water systems. If you go to the next slide, the interesting thing, the important thing, I think, is that we know mathematically, we know as designers and planners and engineers that no amount of gray or green infrastructure will actually solve some of our greatest challenges. We know for a fact that if we put a bioswale and a rain garden on every block in the city, that we would still flood with a 5-year storm or a 10-year storm, or any number of the storms we've been experiencing over the last few years. That if every resident had a rain barrel, in every institution, in every college campus, in every church parking lot, and every big box store stored 1.25 inches of stormwater, that we would be able to handle more water. The water runoff would be cleaned better, but that fundamentally still half of the city is below sea level as sea levels continue to rise. And so I think what is lost sometimes in this debate when we kind of are thinking about a transition from gray to green, I think it's important to step out and also look at the entire framing, and going back up to that watershed scale and understanding how we are still completely reliant on pumps, still completely reliant on levees. And so that no matter how green we may get at one scale, there's bigger work, there are bigger issues that we have to address that isn't about plants. It's about, as Jessica started us off with, about fundamental philosophies of settlement, our relationship to property ownership, whether or not communities are able to move and adapt because the water moves and shifts and adapts, or if we will continue to be an environment where people are locked in by property rights and land tenure, by economic systems, by infrastructural systems that are too hard to shift. So I'll wrap up my slides with these images, efforts from the Water Leaders Institute to Ripple Effect, to the last image is from St. Anthony Green Streets again, that when we really, if we think about it as a philosophy, our role as practitioners shouldn't just be pushing an idea about something that is more green or more natural and assuming that that is good, but really finding ways to work with entire communities to be actually engaging these questions of what is gray, what is green, what is natural. And at this point in time, in the 21st century, in the Mississippi River Delta, knowing all the concrete and all the landscapes that we've created, what kinds of landscapes are we trying to fashion for ourselves in the future? What kinds of hybrids of gray and green do we need to create? And which forces are allowed to dominate across all these scales? With that, I'll pass it on to Blake.
Thank you, Aaron. So I think one of the biggest parts about neighborhoods is the neighbors, right? So when we are out there doing community engagement or just talking from one porch to the other, COVID, we need to be having these real discussions about what works, what is actually functioning, and are we going to let aesthetics or what we are taught to think is aesthetically pleasing. For example, a turf grass that is installed with a maximum depth of minimum 3 inches probably. So instead we can go in and we can put in these bioswales, rain gardens, everything that Aaron just mentioned. And you know, sometimes you got to throw some paint on it. You got to draw a Saints player, whatever it takes to get attention. But it'll get people talking. And as they're talking, green infrastructure for us as planners and other professionals, floodplain managers, we know about green infrastructure. We know it's trendy. We know that people are on it and learning more with sessions like this. But we need to be able to bring it down and share it with people who do other things as professionals. So when we're talking about green infrastructure, one of the best benefits is that it's so logical. We have done a lot of outreach at schools. You can see in the photos, the photo on the right is from WEFTech conference that was in New Orleans a few years ago. And that is a service project where we have volunteers from the conference come out and install a massive planting area next to the Treme Center. And in doing things like that, we're able to have these very realistic conversations about, okay, I'm from New Orleans. I know when there's an issue, I'm going to go put a cone in the middle of that pothole. I'm going to let people know. I'm going to do something about it because we can't always wait on the proper authorities to come around to handle it. So we need to recognize green infrastructure as something that is very tangible. It's very easy to maintain. If, you know, we're thinking back to that larger scale of things coming downstream, if we know that there's leaves clogging a bioswale further up the block, just go clean it out. You don't have to bring in huge pumping equipment and all of the great infrastructure that we rely on today. One of the final things I want to mention is that neighbors collectively can come together and become neighborhood champions. And that's something that Waterwise Gulf South and other local organizations are doing a great job of. And it's allowing people to know the extent of their individual impact and what they can do collectively and also on their own. I'm gonna let Jessica jump in there so that I don't take away any more time.
Thank you so much for that, Blake. And so you can move to the next slide. Perfect. So what you see here are a set of images. They're moving relatively quickly. And I want people to look at them and not necessarily focus on the where or the why, but just look at the images. As we tackle the neighborhood scale, we must also understand the placement in resilient and how we come to think of Louisianians and New Orleanians as resilient. We call ourselves resilient, people call us resilient. And the thought that we're able to tackle fear and trauma and rebuild over and over again. I brought these photos in here because I want us to think about our own traumas with water and green. I could have picked pictures of this year or the 30 named hurricanes or anything, but I chose the past because those are the images that have shaped us. So we've talked a lot about the men in the boardroom who shaped the policies and how money is spent. We talked about Watershed and how it's been changed and moved for the economic purposes of our country. But all of that impacts how we view ourselves in this state of mind. This concept has also led to the disinvestment in people, particularly people of Louisiana, because they think we are resilient. It's like that thing you may see on social media, check on your strong friend. Maybe we should say, check on the strong Louisianians, right? On the surface, it seems like we're noble and that we can help each other. I remember the last hurricane, my neighbors came by and they helped me pick up leaves and debris. And we know what to do when something bad happens. I think Blake just alluded to that very well. When something floods or if there's a pothole, we know what to do. But this also means that we're perpetuating PTSD and the harms that come with it. Our memories, when there are many people who believe that levees have been blown, and whether or not you believe that, Katrina, I'm not here to discuss the conspiracies or not conspiracies, but there have been many situations of levees being blown in the history of Louisiana. And that particularly Carnarvon, Louisiana, which is 13 miles outside of New Orleans, was an area that was blown and flooded parts of New Orleans, particularly low-income communities, Black communities. There also is other things, the loss of economic stability. You may have savings, now it's gone. The loss of education, you were in school, now you're not. The loss of resources. We are not talking about that, but we are resilient, so we'll figure it out. Even today, as we ask communities to build their own green infrastructure, there are many programs like Blake mentioned and Aaron mentioned where we're teaching neighborhoods and communities and leaders what green infrastructure is. We're still asking them to do the work. Be resilient inside of your own trauma. And when something happens, figure it out inside of your own trauma. I've given you the tools, but here, deal with your own trauma. Being resilient may not be what we need. Cause and effect of the stories that we've talked about from the pictures that you may have seen from 100 years ago as we remember the situations, the identity, and the relationships to those events. And what this means is that we remember specific details, we remember specific things, and particularly remember how we feel. So the sense of resilience is a set of values, right, that people in Louisiana have built ourselves around. The Saints talk about it. Our food, right, Raising Cane's, we love New Orleans. I mean, every single thing is about resilience. But let's think about, should we be resilient? And if we are resilient, does that mean that it leads to the historical disinvestment in our communities? Should neighborhoods continue to foot the bill, pay for their own green infrastructure, pay for their own work on their home, and be subjugated to that trauma at the same time? And if so, how can we get our governments, whether it's our city, our state, or federal, to learn and think of us as not resilient? I'm going to end on the fact that I lived in New York when Hurricane Sandy hit, and it was a very different reality. People were scared, just like we were scared. They were confused. But the difference was that they didn't know what to do. Louisianians would just hop on in. But people in New York didn't know what to do. But this is the interesting dynamic. Because they didn't know what to do, they got resources rapidly, quickly. They had more resources than we could ever see in any investment in any community, faster. Some people attributed that to, oh, the big banks and, you know, huge investment in companies. But the point being, what it boils down to is when people think that you're not used to something, they're more willing to give you the resources to deal with that something. So I just want us to reflect on that and think about, if we're always being resilient, is it to our benefit or to our detriment? I'm going to hand it off to James to wrap up.
Thank you to all of our speakers. It's been an incredible, very informative conversation. I'm going to ask you all to turn on your cameras and your mics. We're going to get into the next part of our discussion. We're going to incorporate some questions from the audience as we talk. So as we mentioned earlier, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And so we ask for you, if you do have questions, to put them in the Q&A, and we'll kind of weave them into the questions as we move forward. While we're waiting for additional questions from the audience, we will go through some of our questions that we have set up in advance. So with that, I want to start with our first one. And anyone can chime in on this. There's really no order, just kind of let me know who wants to start, and then we'll kind of go around. What does green or natural mean? And what work do you think what work do those words do when we use them in infrastructure design, planning, policy, and community engagement?
Yeah, I can start. I think watching the advance of green infrastructure into our kind of policies and practices, it's both exciting and the ways in which we talk about how it suggests a different relationship to the environment, the ways in which we're saying, hey, let's let soil and plants do some of that work of cleaning water, of storing it, and how do we kind of reconnect to the physics of natural flow rather than trying to hide water away. I think it's, like I said earlier, I think it's important to think about what are some bigger shifts that are required of us. I think in some cases, in a lot of the work that we're doing, we are shifting to using more plants in our renderings and in our engineered systems, but that oftentimes the underlying principles may still be the same. That a parking lot that has permeable paving and the water drains into a system of boxes that counts as green infrastructure because there's more permeability and water soaking into the ground and you're storing more water, so there's less pumping. But how different philosophically is that from a concrete box culvert or some other kind of system that we associate more with great infrastructure? So it's so I think even as we develop these new means and methods, how do we ask some of the harder questions so that we're not in a place of just creating, kind of shifting in a new generation of products and professional skill sets, but we're not asking ourselves to step back and say, wait, what are these bigger relationships to the river, to the delta, to the swamp, that we really have to address if we want to be here in centuries?
Thank you, Aaron.
Oh, I just want to add too, I think when I was in school, I kind of did a lot of work around sustainability and green design. And some of the ways, so the historian Bill Cronin, he talks about how the words green and natural, they might be used as something that there's a kind of assumed good, that it's whether you relate it to God's creation, it's something we have a whole ethos of conservation and protection of national parks and the images that pop into our heads when we think about corporate advertising, the images that pop into our heads when we see the word green and how we connect it to organic or natural or ecological. What I would argue is that there's a bit of a sloppiness in how we use those words, and that if we really kind of drill down into what it means for something to be ecological or what it means for something to be green, it's not that it's great that they can hold so many ideas, but that if there's an assumed good when we use the word green, oftentimes that means we don't question as much what's really at stake, or what are some of the underlying frameworks that allow this infrastructure to exist. Yeah.
Thanks. Jessica, Blake, anything to add to this question? Okay, so I want to go to our next one, really building off of Jessica's presentation. How can we shift away from water is a human right to water is life in our daily communication and planning around rivers and waterways?
Thank you, James. So when the first slide, we talked a lot about shifting the understanding, right? And we often say water is a human right, and how do we get to the life? One, it starts with how we are planning around water and who we're planning for. So oftentimes if you're an engineer, an architect, and an urban planner on the call, you're often saying, you're given a project, you're paid to do a project, right? And obviously you think that your client, and you believe your client is that particular entity. Shifting away from that, not totally and telling your client, no, I'm not working for you anymore, but instead saying to your client and saying, well, let's look at the whole picture, right? If you're building this particular facility or business. And I think I even looked in the chat and just looking at questions like, well, people don't want to do it, but looking at it as who is it benefiting, right? Who can you benefit multiple parties at once? So that's the first step, is saying, I want to benefit all of these people, not just the square feet that I'm in. The second thing is really looking into other philosophies when you're urban planning. I think we're in school, I was in school, and we're often given a set of books and a set of ideologies and philosophies that we work from. And that's perfectly okay. It's a great starting point. But as many people say, learning does not stop. It never ends. It's a lifelong process. And looking into other ways that we do things. I mean, Aaron mentioned a lot about the Urban Water Plan and how a lot of the work we look at have been based on the Dutch dialogues. But let's even go further than that. What are other people doing in other countries? Even the countries that are not necessarily like developing countries where we don't necessarily look at for advice, looking at the pros and the cons of the work that we do. And then again, I'm gonna finalize and say the philosophical concept of it all is, how do we get to water's life? And I had a huge debate with someone recently about that for a project we're working on. I said, well, no, we have to say right, because it's what we've been doing. And I want us to think about what we've been doing in water and greenery hasn't really done much for us, right? We've built levees, but they fail. So the concept that because something has been done for a long time has to be pushed back on, and thinking again about all of the things that use water, right? I want us to really drill down on, we're not the only ones that drink water. Your dog, if you have a dog at home, or a cat, if you have a farm, you have animals that drink water. And whatever water that they consume is what eventually you may consume in many different forms. So looking at the system and its interconnectivity is really important in that shift. So there are 3 ways to do the shift, and maybe you can apply one, maybe you can apply all. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, so what we wanted to do next was really kind of go deeper into one, how do we prioritize green infrastructure and low impact development to really combat those ongoing compelling crises that we know we have? That's open to anyone who would like to answer. Basically, how can green infrastructure and low income development contribute to the multi-impact benefits to combat ongoing compelling crises?
I'll start, and I'm sure Jessica and Aaron can supplement what I have to say. So I think in addition to that question, there's a lot of questions in the chat that are kind of along the same topic. So it's talking about, how do we make things happen? What if GI fails? Well, what if the gray infrastructure fails, et cetera? So I think one of the biggest ways you're going to come to action is by, one, leveraging the maintenance or installation of other projects. So if you're already going in and tearing out a sidewalk and it's right next to an open ditch drainage, well, you can probably combine those together. If you're doing street repairs, or expanding a street, or hopefully narrowing a street, then when you put in that parking, make it permeable. You can just combine different capital improvements to come together. And then, of course, based on the public interest, the more that the public becomes interested and wants these things and notifies their elected officials about them, then the data comes in to support what the public is asking for. So there is a lot of momentum sitting there. We just have to organize it and make it happen.
Yeah, I think I've been working. I see from the Q&A that there are a couple names I recognize, and people who've been working on this stuff a lot longer than I have. I've been working on this stuff for about a decade, and as a designer, as a planner, also in terms of community engagement and environmental education. And one of the things that I think about is that green infrastructure, the ways in which it's funded right now, and I think this connects to a lot of the questions that people are asking, is through an economic lens, through an economic framework. And so whether we're talking about the National Disaster Resilience Competition that led to HUD funding the city's Gentilly Resilience District, to the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that's funding another $100+ million of work in the city and across the country, a lot of that goes to green infrastructure. It's that the ways in which we get projects funded now is by proving that they provide economic value, not because, and so every project comes with a benefit cost analysis. And so whether it's the city applying for it, a city, a parish, a state, like you have to prove that the construction of this feature will generate enough of a return that it's worth building now. So if we invest $10 million now in a system of bioswales for a neighborhood, that the reduced damages from flooding, engineers will be hired to develop a hydrological model. They'll run design storms through that model with and without that green infrastructure, and be able to say, this will result in $12 million in savings or $8 million plus. And in a BCA, you might add in there increases in property values, or you might use the notion of ecosystem services to say the biodiversity, the access to a waterfront or a water feature, or some of those things you might attribute economic value to as well. And then you add up all of those benefits and compare it to the costs. And so out of that benefit cost analysis, out of that BCA, we make a determination about whether or not green infrastructure is worth building. And that's the same for gray as well, but I think those are the mechanisms that I've seen being used over and over again. And so I think and this goes a bit to Ashley's question in the Q&A, when I think about that model for how we invest in infrastructure is so dominant, especially any kind of changes in infrastructure and innovative infrastructure, it's so dominant that we almost can't see any other way. And this will sound counterintuitive, but I think we're locked in a system where I'm not sure we're investing in the right thing. If we want to address things like the future of the Mississippi River, the future of the Delta, we have a coastal master plan that's not really funded. We have an urban water plan that's not really funded. And I think the current framework that we have, where we can only apply an economic lens, where even somebody dying is turned into a dollar figure, where the value of trees and the flow of water is turned into a dollar figure, then it keeps us from actually addressing the bigger problems that we have. And so what I think would be important is actually investing more in environmental education and the democratic processes, in civic dialogue around these issues, so that we collectively as a society can choose collectively to move in a different direction in terms of how we want to relate to the water that falls from the sky, how we want to relate to the flow of the river. And that's tremendously challenging. I can bet that most people on this call aren't like hearing this in conversations, because it's very hard to say there's an economic benefit to paying people to go learn about soils, to learn about how water flows. But without that knowledge, kind of society-wide, I don't know how we make that shift. So what I see is we'll incrementally continue to make changes to landscapes. We might integrate policies around permeability, around stormwater retention, but all those are metrics that are pegged to their like performances and standards that like we kind of break an understanding of the environment we live in into these things that we can fit into spreadsheets and that we can attribute economic figures to. And so I guess my response isn't how do we invest more in green infrastructure? If we keep investing more in green infrastructure, that is the people that will get paid, engineering firms, design firms, planning agencies, that's fine. But if we step back, how are we actually changing our relationship to these forces, to these natural forces, you want to call it that, to the flow of water? And how are we really shaping community resilience in the long term if we know that green infrastructure alone, in and of itself, doesn't solve some of our greatest challenges?
Yeah, I want to just quickly, I know I want to be cognizant of other questions, but I want to chime in and piggyback off of Aaron and just comment and say that we have historically not invested in people. When we say we invest in people, we throw around the ideas of equity and justice, but again, it's only in terms of economic development. People as a concept, I only invest in people if I see a deliverable at the end of that. And usually the deliverable is an economic goal, right? Even, I love James, but even with foundations, right? We often say, we're going to invest in you, but I need to see 65 deliverables and I need to see, 25 pictures with children. We don't want to see actual structural change because structural change cannot be seen. And so in all of that, we have to really understand that we have to shift our philosophy as human beings, right? And in order to shift how we are resilient or how we manage our communities, we have to then deal with and grapple with the systems that we built or we're built upon, right? Our homes are built on systems that do not believe that, right? And we already know that, right? The communities that are lower lying or communities that were not as valued, right? The communities that flood more are communities that were put there often on purpose. The communities that are in Cancer Alley are not there because they're valued. And what is valued in those communities is economic opportunity. We put communities in low income areas and areas that are below sea level so they can go to work in proximity to places that are of economic value. Everything is centered around that. So if we're going to change how we view green nature, it goes back to my first slide about water is life, is saying, are we going to shift our understanding as water and green belonging to me or belonging to everyone else? And to agree with water belonging or green belonging to everyone would also require us to change how we define value. And that's what it always boils down to. Value is always the key. So just doubling down on what Aaron said is that we have to change that. And I don't know if we're going to ever, I would love to be optimistic, but I don't know if we're ever going to break that system. And if I'm also stuck on the sense of we can educate, but we're still educating them in the system that they live in, right? It's almost better to start from scratch because someone can teach me what green infrastructure is. And I always get this question, oh, I learned about a biosphere today, but are the pumps on? That's always so you're still giving people a different framework, but they only care about the system that's around them because the system impacts their livelihood. So I can go on, this could be like an hour conversation. So I'll wrap up there and give it to James.
Thank you, Jessica. A lot of the questions we're getting in the chat are around, it's a mixture of really big, how do we make impact? And we also have a lot of questions around quick fixes. So I wanted to give Blake an opportunity to kind of chime in on the conversation we've been having so far. And then from there, I really want to talk about a question that's in the chat. It says, what's the first step that governments can make to assist communities in their resiliency efforts? And the reason I wanted to go there is because I also think that changing of mind state and trying to change the system is also an important part of that question as well. So how do we get government to really make that first step?
Thanks, Jim. Just to briefly touch on the latter question, I think that what we're doing in New Orleans, thanks to HUD and the national program, is a great first step because it's allowing all these pilot projects to prove what we're saying. And just as with anything else, we have different types of learners. So it may be that someone needs the data, someone needs to have the conversation that we could spend hours having, but some people need to see it in action. And if they're not seeing the green infrastructure in action, what I commonly am hearing is that they're seeing that things are worsening. The amount of times and the amount of conversations I have had that start off saying, before Katrina, it wasn't like this, is astounding. It is, people notice, they know what's going on, they know when it's not working, they know the need is worsening, it's expanding. And so even if we, had all of Gentilly and convinced everyone to have green infrastructure, then, it may spread to Central City by the time we even finish. So having these quick installs, they're not solutions. They are helping to alleviate. But they're also not Band-Aids. You know, they do work. They are just contributing to ways that we can handle things. So rather than relying on just a single approach, we're trying to incorporate these other ways. So you don't have to be 100% on board with green infrastructure. You can be halfway. You can be, 83%, whatever you're about. But I think one of the hangups is often about, okay, well, if green infrastructure is so that the residents can maintain it, then we need to make sure that they actually can maintain it. So, if that means like getting your little nephew over there and like making them pick up some leaves, or having your neighbor who was inspired by seeing what you installed, maybe they'll learn how to install it and maintain it at their house, and then they'll be able to help out when you're in need. But we've also come to accept, kind of on a pride basis, what we already maintain. People are out there cutting their lawns in 100 degrees and 87% humidity, and they're not complaining about it because that's just what they have to do. So I think when we get down to inconveniences, we need to think about how inconvenient it's going to be if we don't do something. And I'll just leave it there because, like Jessica said, I'd go on forever.
I do want to thank you for that, Blake. Yeah, I think that I want to provide a practical opportunity as well. I think I mentioned earlier, we don't invest in our water infrastructure. When I say we don't, I'm not saying you and I or your company or your city or your state, but our federal government doesn't invest in it. And they haven't done so for years, right? They provide a lot of tax incentives for energy companies, but they do not provide tax incentive for green infrastructure or even a utility to update their infrastructure. So one thing that I've been working on with national partners is something called the Water Act. So it's the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability. I'm sorry, I use resilience all the time. So when I don't use it, it's confusing. Reliability Act, and that it would be $35 billion from the federal government, from a very menial tax increase or movement of taxes from one area to another to our water infrastructure. And whenever we're saying, how do I do this? And how can I afford this? We have to think bigger. Water infrastructure is all around us. And that's another issue, is that we don't see it. A member of the collaborative sent a picture yesterday of 5 levels of water infrastructure that they're working on locally. And he literally showed pipes and then some other pipes. And it's probably like, 200 years worth of pipes is one little area. And so a piecemeal of a $6 million here or a small grant from the EPA or a small grant from here is not going to fix that or make the overhaul that what Blake is talking about. We're not going to be able to fix our neighborhoods and be here in the next 20 to 50 years if we have small incremental change. And so we need to start asking for big change. We can't just, and then on top of that, we're also fighting for the small crumbs that we have. And there's a question in there about, like, what about large scale? We have the Louisiana Watershed Initiative, and I'm a part of Region 8. And literally the question that constantly comes up is, but we don't have enough money. Well, we can't do this because there's not enough money. Well, then we need to start thinking solution-based, and why isn't there enough money? What are we investing in, and what can we disinvest in to invest in this? Because again, this is a bigger investment of just not preventing or reducing flood. It's also about creating resilient communities that can continue, because the outcome, if we don't, is mass migration, and no city in Louisiana or any other Gulf state can handle 400,000 people from New Orleans migrating to Baton Rouge or Shreveport or wherever. We saw a little inkling of that for Hurricane Katrina and how cities were overwhelmed with 500 people. Can you imagine what the whole of Southeast Louisiana is going to look like? So we really need to start asking big questions and asking federal government help for this support and stop piecemealing off small grants. So I just wanted to say that there are possibilities and we need to start thinking about them.
I want to maybe move over to James's question about governments and what they can do. And maybe it's obvious by now from the things I've been saying, but I'm definitely not here. Again, I worked on the urban water plan. I believe in the efficacy of green infrastructure for a lot of different reasons, but I'm not here to shill for green infrastructure. And what I'm going to say may actually sound strange. I don't think we should, at this moment in time, be in like our focus shouldn't just be on investing in more green infrastructure, because we're not spending a commensurate amount of our resources on investing in collective decision making. When we look at COVID and how quickly that hit us as a country and each individual community, and the choices that we had to make as communities about when to lock down, how to lock down, whom to pay, whom to support, so they could go stay home, and that we're still in the throes of that. And I think through that crisis, through this crisis, we've seen all the ways in which we've had to rely on scientists and professional experts, the ways in which we've had to rely on the media and communications folks to trust people to understand things like flattening the curve and to understand these abstractions around how the behaviors now might relate to the entire populace, and how their behaviors now might play out in 3 weeks, in 3 months, in 6 months, and how that's connected to the local economy, to the global economy, and so on and so forth. Some of the questions, Jessica's brought up mass migration. Some of the questions are about sea level rise and climate adaptation. And I think one of the ways to think about where we are with being in the Delta, experiencing coastal line loss and experiencing sea level rise is that I think we're already experiencing climate change, kind of like COVID, in somewhat stretched out form, that we collectively are having to make tremendously hard decisions about where people should live, whether to invest in more pumps versus elevating homes versus relocating communities. And that on a kind of geologic lens, it's going to be as fast as COVID, like that feeling in the middle of March. I think the next few decades, that's what we're experiencing in relation to the climate crisis. And so when we think about green infrastructure and we think about the Gentilly Resilience District, for example, and if we're investing over $100 million in green infrastructure, and I'll say I'm working on it, I get paid through that in part because of my work as a designer and working in community engagement. We're investing a lot of money in a space. Gentilly is probably on average 5 to 6 feet below sea level. And so we're investing in an environment and calling it a resilience district. And I think a question is, what forms of resilience do the kind of forms of green infrastructure we're putting into place foster, and which forms of resilience aren't really addressed? And so when I think about the future of Gentilly, when I think about the future of Broadmoor, when I think about the Green Dot Plan, going back to the use of the word green, the Green Dot Plan that was so controversial after Katrina, we've kicked those cans down the road, and we haven't, and we've kind of, I think, not given up, but we just ignore the fact that we have a river that wants to change course. We're ignoring the fact that half the city is below sea level. And so what I would say is, if you're a municipality, if you're a state government agency, if you're a federal agency, you can invest in more green infrastructure. But if we took $100 million in funding and spent half of it, imagine the kinds of work we could do. If we think about a society that can make decisions about COVID or about climate change or about the future of neighborhoods that are below sea level, it requires a deep shared understanding of science. So does that mean investing more in schools and science education? Does that mean investing more in history lessons? And somebody mentioned the Dutch in the questions. A lot of the understanding of Dutch systems is in history and civics class. It's a political system. It's an engineered polder system. It's part of their cultural identity. In terms of the symbols and the ways in which they understand and traverse the landscape. All those things are intertwined. And so I think we need a similar whole-scale shift in how we think about, understand the landscape, and how we are connected to it, and how we collectively make decisions about what this landscape might become, so that we're not locked into metrics of percolation rates and evapotranspiration rates and inches of rain stored. That's all well and good, but that's all we focus on day in and day out. And we keep skipping or ignoring the need, the opportunity to engage in much broader dialogue. It's really, really hard because it's inherently political. Everything we've talked about so far is politics, power. And that's, I think, part of why it's so hard. But we can't abdicate that role and that need to invest in democratic collective decision making, because otherwise, if we just focus on it as technology and infrastructure, I don't actually think we're going to address our biggest challenges.
Thank you, Aaron. Blake and Jessica, do you have anything to add to the last question before we go to our last question?
I want to quickly say, I know, right? I'm going to be very brief, and Aaron mentioned it, a cultural shift. And I think we have to really think about that. And I want to say that I think there was a question, an early question about Advancing Cities grant. And I'm one of the people on the grant, one of the sub-grantees. And I can tell you that a conversation amongst the organizations who are part of this grant wasn't just about economic opportunity, right? Like Aaron said, we can always invest in more green infrastructure. We can always get more businesses to get more DBEs in the system. The goal, there's a short-term goal, right, in creating a structure of policies, but the bigger goal that we've all talked about when we were in the conversations about this grant was about a cultural shift. We want people here in New Orleans to, just like Aaron said, to see water and science and climate as a part of their being, as well as a part of their systems that they live in every day. So when people look at something and look at a catch basin, they don't just think, oh, that's where the water's going, but they're also thinking in their head, oh, the water's probably going to go here, here, and here, and then this is what's happening to the river. We have to have people think more holistically. And to do that, we have to change our culture. So the Dutch are a great example. But I would even say New Orleans is going to be a better example. I'm going to push against the Dutch and say that we're a better example because we are multicultural. We are in a very different system that does not allow for this type of thinking. We talked about earlier with a neoliberal system. So culture is the biggest part. And so I'm going to shift over, but thank you, James.
Blake, wanted to give you a chance before we went to the last question. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, so I'll keep it brief, but just 2 quick points. One, on the Dutch conversation, I just want to do a mention that a lot of people are probably aware of, but going back to the original watershed and city levels of how, we can't just pick up a plan and apply it anywhere. One of the largest differences between New Orleans and the Dutch is how many storms we have to deal with. And that changes so much at a personal level. Like when Jessica was talking about the impacts and how when you see one thing, it'll set you off and make you remember everything else. That, especially this year, is very fresh in people's minds. So I'm not going to go any further with that, but I'll leave it there. The only other thing I want to say is kind of a personal philosophy I go back to when I'm kind of lost, and that's just when you know better, you can do better. So, people aren't going to do better if they don't know about it. So that's where all this education and these conversations we're having right now really come into play, is we got to keep talking about it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you all for this robust conversation. I wish we had another half an hour because I got a bunch of questions, but we are out of time. So once again, thank you to our speakers, our sponsors, and especially all of you that attended. At one point, we were close to 200 people on this Zoom. That's amazing. If you're a certified floodplain manager, please fill out the survey that will appear when you close the Zoom window so that we can assist you with your CEU credits. If you missed any of the summit sessions or love them so much you want to watch them again, you can view the recordings at summit.cpex.org or on the Center for Planning Excellence's YouTube channel. Thanks again for investing your time to learn more about these important topics. If you'd like to hear more about this and other smart growth topics, please join Camille Manning-Broom, the President and CEO of CPEX, and Calvin Gladney, the President and CEO of Smart Growth America, for a casual and virtual conversation over a cup of coffee. Thank you all for attending again. It's been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day.